Well, where my colleagues were talking and sharing their experiences, there was an example that came back to my mind, which was my first birthday in China.
Yeah.
It was just a few weeks after arriving here. In this context, I said, well, it was a bit, we can say, scary or creepy at the beginning because the roads were pretty empty or not crowded. And in those days where I was still adjusting to this new life here, all the measures to prevent the spread of the virus, I started to get sick. You know, I had a fever and headache, and I immediately felt very scared. And in this community feeling or this community organization that you were mentioning, the security guard from the community show up and say, okay, let's measure your temperature. And I had a little fever, so they took me to the hospital. It was actually a guard that was next to the community, so they were not receiving patients, but they made sure that I actually had a fever. So afterwards, they took me together to another hospital, and by that time, the PCR test technology was not well developed or as developed as it is now, so you can get a result in an hour. By that time, was some as 24 hours or 30 hours or something like that. And they say, okay, no worries, we're going to conduct a blood test on you and an x-ray on the chest and see if you have any symptoms of COVID. So the thing is that within 1.5 hours, I already had a result that it was not COVID, but it was food poisoning.
Oh, I see. Well, that's good.
Yeah, it was good. It was not COVID, just food poisoning. But I remember that after that, I called my mom and I say, hey, mom, I have bad and good news. The bad news is that I'm at hospital because I got food poisoning. But the good news is that this is not COVID. And mom, you don't know, you're not going to believe how they took care of me. And actually being there while I was in the call with my mom, the people from the first hospital, the first ward, but they took my temperature, they called to the second hospital to make sure that I was there and that it was not COVID. And it was, you know, impressive. It blew my mind because I was thinking, my God, such a populous country, and they are still taking care of each single person as unique, you know, as trying to avoid that if I was actually infected with COVID, I was not infecting everybody in my community. So yeah, that example came out when my colleagues were talking about their experiences, and I wanted to share this with you. Of course, not the best birthday in my life, having food poisoning, but grateful discovering this collective and community organization of China that is just impressive. And until nowadays, it blows my mind.
Yeah. We do have to remember that this is the most populous nation on the planet, right? Over 1.4 billion people, and it's not easy. It's not easy to manage the pandemic in such a large country, such a population-dense country as well. I mean, here in this city, we've got 20 million plus people, right? A city here in China with a few million people is considered sort of a smaller, medium-sized city. So in terms of the organizational capabilities and ability to control outbreaks so it doesn't spread fast, because if it does, it spreads very fast. We've seen the subways here in Beijing and some of the larger cities, how crowded it can be. So that's why I think China is so adamant that we got to control the outbreak at its beginning and at its initial stages, so not all people will get infected. You wanted to add something as well, Marco?
No, it's just, I think, a general thought, because I think this has to do with the capacity of the Communist Party of China to really organize society. Because, I mean, if you have a challenge like COVID, it's not so, I mean, in some ways, not so different from what was the poverty alleviation campaign. I mean, the party is able to mobilize the whole society for one target in the different levels. And also, I mean, the capacity of learning, because during the whole pandemic, you have different stages of the pandemic and different learnings. I remember, for instance, one story in Beijing, I think it was still 2020, that one person went to the hospital with fever, was Mr. Tang, and okay, he had got fever, so they started to do research. Okay, they tested positive, so with the cell phone, they were able to track all the steps of Mr. Tang in the last 2 weeks. And then finally, after 24 hours, they found out he was infected in Shifadi, the big wholesale market. And then with that, they closed the surroundings and they controlled the pandemic in Beijing, and they tested everybody in the city in 7 days. And if you get 2 years later, when you had for instance, the outbreak in Guangzhou, they were able to test 18 million people in 3 or 4 days. So, I mean, all the learning also experience of Chinese officials, Chinese authorities, health authorities in this 2 or 3 years was amazing. And at the end of the day, what you get now from China is that, I mean, many specialists, they think that other pandemics will come. And guess what? Which is the only country in the world who now has a knowledge accumulated to deal with the pandemic. I mean, the capacity of doing tests in everybody, 1.4 billion people, each 72 hours, this is amazing. And of course, I mean, this is not a good news for us, but when another pandemic comes, the world will definitely need to learn with China, because it's the only country who, at the end of the day, had a real experience of how to deal with the pandemic.